I'm 35 years old, my name is Claire Bennett, and I manage compliance for a regional healthcare network. My job is built on documenting facts, noticing patterns, and staying calm when everyone else is emotional. I used to think those habits belonged only at work. I didn't realize I'd need them most around my own family. Every birthday dinner, my Aunt Evelyn brought the same gift, not expensive, just thoughtful. A handwritten card, tucked beneath a crystal tumbler she'd given me on my 30th birthday. She always said, "A good glass reminds you to slow down before you speak." For 5 years, I used that same tumbler whenever our family gathered. It became our quiet ritual. She'd smile when she saw it, and I'd tap the rim once before taking my first sip. On Saturday, October 12, she arrived 40 minutes early to my mother's 62nd birthday dinner, carrying a homemade lemon tart she'd spent nearly 3 hours baking. I watched her smooth the whipped cream with the edge of a butter knife while humming softly in my kitchen. At 7:55 p.m., she adjusted the candles herself because she knew my mother liked perfectly even spacing. She still tried, even after years of rarely hearing a thank you. At exactly 8:17 p.m., everything she had quietly helped hold together collapsed. My younger sister, Natalie, lifted her wine glass, looked directly at me, and laughed. "Can we all appreciate that Claire is 35 and still alone?" The room erupted. My mother laughed the hardest. Not a polite chuckle. Not nervous laughter. She leaned back in her chair, covered her mouth, and laughed until tears formed in the corners of her eyes. I looked at my crystal tumbler. There was a single cube of ice floating in amber iced tea, slowly spinning as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I imagined throwing the drink across the dining room. Then I imagined standing up and walking out without another word. I rejected both thoughts before they ever reached my hands. Instead, I wrapped my fingers around the cool glass, felt the engraved edge Aunt Evelyn had chosen 5 years earlier, and gently placed it back onto the oak table. The sound was almost impossibly soft. A single click. Everyone heard it. I looked first at Natalie, then at my mother. Finally, I said one sentence so calmly that the laughter disappeared before I finished speaking. No one reached for another bite of dinner. No one looked at the birthday cake anymore. The only sound left in the room was the grandfather clock in the hallway counting another second. Here's what my mother didn't understand that night, and what Natalie couldn't possibly have known. That sentence wasn't born from one joke. It was built from 23 years of smaller ones. From every holiday where success was measured by a wedding ring instead of character. From every promotion that somehow mattered less than someone else's engagement. From every time I smiled because keeping the peace felt easier than telling the truth. Looking back now, I can see that 8:17 p.m. wasn't the moment my family broke. It was simply the moment they could no longer pretend it hadn't. Months later, after everything had changed, that same crystal tumbler sat untouched on my dining table beside one empty chair, catching the afternoon sunlight while someone waited quietly at my front door. The truth is, my family had always kept score. Not with spreadsheets or spoken rules, but with wedding invitations, anniversary photos, and Christmas cards displayed on my mother's fireplace mantel. The mantel was our unofficial leaderboard. Married children stood in the center. Grandchildren earned the highest shelves. Everything else was arranged farther toward the edges. When Natalie married Daniel at 28, their framed wedding portrait replaced a landscape painting my father had loved for years. 6 months later, their pregnancy announcement took the place where my framed certificate for Earning Employee of the Year had briefly stood after Aunt Evelyn insisted my mother display it. 3 days later, the certificate had quietly disappeared into a hallway closet. Nobody mentioned it. I didn't either. That was my part in all of this. I told myself it wasn't worth arguing over a picture frame. Then it wasn't worth arguing over a joke. Then it wasn't worth arguing over another holiday where someone asked, "So, still single?" Little by little, silence became my contribution to the family tradition. Aunt Evelyn never accepted that tradition. She was my mother's older sister by 4 years, a retired elementary school librarian who still mailed handwritten birthday cards with pressed flowers tucked inside. She remembered everyone's favorite dessert, everyone's important meetings, everyone's fears. If kindness could be measured in ordinary Tuesdays instead of dramatic sacrifices, she'd have been the richest person I'd ever known. Whenever relatives asked why I wasn't married, she always redirected the conversation. Claire just helped negotiate a $4.8 million compliance audit. Or, did I tell you she volunteers every second Saturday at the Literacy Center? She never exaggerated. She simply refused to let my entire identity fit inside an empty space on a relationship form. I loved her for that. I just never said it often enough. Even worse, I sometimes laughed along with everyone else. Not because the jokes were funny. Because I thought smiling would shorten them. Looking back, I understand something uncomfortable. Every forced laugh sounded like permission. By the time I turned 35, my family genuinely believed they were teasing someone who didn't mind. That illusion existed partly because I helped build it. Which is why I made sure no one could later claim the birthday dinner had been some misunderstanding. On October 3, my mother texted our family group chat. Mom *, birthday dinner. Saturday the 12th, 6 o'clock. Everyone coming? I replied within 3 minutes. Me *, I'll be there. Need me to bring anything? Natalie answered with a thumbs up emoji. Dad wrote, looking forward to it. 2 days later, my mother texted again. Mom *, Claire, don't forget the sparkling cider you usually bring. Me *, already bought 4 bottles. The following Wednesday, I confirmed again during our weekly phone call. I'll be there by 5:30 to help set up. Good, my mother answered. Natalie and Daniel will be a little late. Aunt Evelyn overheard because she was riding with me to volunteer at the Literacy Center. She smiled and whispered, your mother does appreciate your reliability, even if she forgets to say it. I wanted to believe that. Then, just before hanging up, my mother laughed lightly and added the sentence I'd heard since high school. Just promise me one thing, Claire. What? Don't be so sensitive. At the time, it sounded like another harmless comment. Later, I realized it had never been advice. It was permission for everyone else to say whatever they wanted without expecting consequences. By 7:40 p.m. on October 12th, everything looked exactly the way my mother liked it. The dining table was set with 8 matching ivory plates, polished silverware, and cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. The lemon tart Aunt Evelyn had baked rested beside the chocolate birthday cake Natalie had ordered from a boutique bakery $4.96. For bottles of sparkling cider chilled in a metal bucket exactly where my mother had asked me to place them. If someone had walked into the room before dinner, they would have seen a family celebrating another birthday. They wouldn't have noticed how carefully everyone already knew their assigned roles. Dad carved the roast. Natalie entertained the room. My mother accepted compliments. I quietly filled empty glasses. Aunt Evelyn made sure everyone else had what they needed before serving herself. At 8:14 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from a coworker congratulating me on a promotion that would officially begin Monday morning. I smiled to myself and slipped the phone back into my purse. There would be time to tell everyone after dessert. Or so I thought. 3 minutes later. 8:17 p.m. Natalie stood to make what she called a birthday toast. She thanked Mom for always putting family first. She joked about Dad's obsession with grilling. Everyone laughed. Then her eyes found me. You know, she said with a grin, Mom deserves credit for raising 2 daughters. She paused just long enough for everyone to look in my direction. One gave her grandchildren. Another pause. The other is 35 and still alone. Laughter burst around the table. Before I could process it, my mother wiped tears from her eyes and repeated the line she'd used my entire life. Oh, Claire. She shook her head. Don't be so sensitive. That sentence landed harder than Natalie's joke. Because it told everyone else the joke was acceptable. I looked down at my crystal tumbler. The ice had almost completely melted. For one reckless second, I imagined standing and telling Natalie exactly how many nights I'd spent helping her edit college papers she'd forgotten about. I imagined reminding my mother who drove her to every cardiology appointment after Dad's knee surgery. I imagined listing every holiday meal I'd cooked, every bill I'd quietly paid, every problem I'd solved while somehow remaining the family's disappointment. Then I let every one of those speeches disappear. Anger would only become another story about my attitude. Instead, I placed my drink on the table. Click. The room fell strangely quiet. I looked at my mother first, then at Natalie. Finally, I said, if being married is the only accomplishment this family knows how to celebrate, then you've been overlooking the wrong daughter for a very long time. No shouting. No insults. Just silence. Nobody laughed after that. Natalie's smile faded almost immediately. Dad stared at his plate. My mother's expression hardened, as though I had broken an unspoken rule simply by refusing to play mine. The person who moved first wasn't me. It was Aunt Evelyn. She calmly folded her linen napkin, placed it beside her untouched dinner, and rested one gentle hand over mine. She didn't defend me. She didn't argue with anyone. She simply smiled with heartbreaking kindness and said, "Claire, we can go whenever you're ready." There were no tears in her eyes. That somehow hurt even more, because her calm acceptance told me this wasn't shocking to her. She had expected it. On the drive home, memories arrived one after another like streetlights passing through the windshield. My college graduation, when my mother's first question had been whether I'd met anyone special. Natalie's bridal shower, where relatives introduced me as the career sister. Christmas dinners where promotions earned 30 seconds of conversation, but engagements filled entire evenings. Every time I'd laughed awkwardly instead of saying, "That's enough." Every time I'd convinced myself keeping the peace was kindness. It wasn't. It was participation. For years, I believed I was only the one being hurt. Driving home beside Aunt Evelyn in complete silence, I finally admitted the harder truth. I hadn't just been the target. I'd been one more person teaching my family that treating me this way would never cost them anything. The next morning at 9:12 a.m., my phone lit up with messages. Dad wrote, *, "Can we all just move on?" *. My cousin Melissa texted, *, "Don't let one bad joke ruin the family." *. I started typing a reply. *, "A joke is only funny when everyone laughs." I deleted it. Then I wrote something much harsher. "I've spent 23 years being your family's punchline. I'm finished." I deleted that too. Neither message would change anyone's heart. At 9:34 a.m., I sent the only message that matched the piece I wanted. "I love this family, but I won't participate in conversations that measure someone's worth by their relationship status. My door will always be open to anyone willing to treat each other with respect. If that day comes, you'll be welcome at my table." No accusations. No scorekeeping. No argument. 3 minutes later, my mother replied with only 5 words. "Don't be so sensitive, Claire." For the first time in my life, I didn't answer. Instead, I called Aunt Evelyn. By the end of the week, we planned our own Thanksgiving dinner. Not as revenge. As relief. We rented extra folding chairs from the church for $4.48, borrowed mismatched dishes from neighbors, and invited anyone who didn't have somewhere they genuinely wanted to be. On Thanksgiving afternoon, 21 people squeezed into my little house. Nothing matched. The gravy was too thin. One pie burned around the edges. Someone's toddler spilled cranberry sauce across a white tablecloth. Everyone laughed. Not at someone. With someone. Across town, my mother's dinner looked beautiful in every photograph my cousin later showed me. 8 polished place settings. Perfect flowers. Professional catering. Only 5 guests actually came. Natalie spent most of the evening checking her phone. My mother kept asking whether anyone had heard from me. No one answered. Meanwhile, Aunt Evelyn stood in my kitchen wearing a faded blue apron and somehow managed to organize 21 people without raising her voice once. Watching her gently direct strangers and relatives alike, I realized something. She had been quietly holding families together her entire life. People simply noticed her work only after she stopped doing it for them. Winning didn't feel the way I expected. There wasn't satisfaction. There wasn't triumph. There was grief. Not because I missed being mocked. Because I finally accepted that the family I'd spent decades trying to earn had never actually existed. Later that December, cousin Melissa admitted something that stayed with me. Aunt Linda grew up believing love had to be earned, she said quietly. She ranked everyone because that's how Grandma ranked her. It explained my mother's behavior. It didn't excuse it. Pain can be inherited. Cruelty is still a choice. 2 months later, on February 18 at 2:06 p.m., my doorbell rang. My mother stood outside. Alone. I saw her through the front window while I finished washing a coffee mug. For the first time, I didn't rush. She waited almost 4 minutes before I opened the door. She tried her usual smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes. I think you've made your point. I simply stepped aside without answering. She looked around my dining room. The crystal tumbler Aunt Evelyn had given me sat in its usual place, catching the afternoon light. My mother tried guilt. Then obligation. Then tears. None of them worked. Finally, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, she asked, "Do you really think there's still a place for me?" I answered honestly, "Yes. But the first apology isn't for me." She looked confused. "It's for Aunt Evelyn. She spent years loving all of us while watching us fail each other." My mother nodded. When Aunt Evelyn arrived 20 minutes later, the two sisters asked if they could speak privately. I stayed in the kitchen. I never asked exactly what was said. Some conversations belong to the people who finally become brave enough to have them. I only know they both cried. And when they returned, my mother hugged her sister longer than I'd ever seen. A year has passed now. On the first Sunday of every month, we gather around whichever table is available. Sometimes it's mine. Sometimes it's Aunt Evelyn's. Sometimes it's even my mother's. Nobody has assigned seats anymore. Nobody asks who's ahead in life. Last month, Natalie called me before accepting a management position. Not to compare salaries. To ask how I handled leading a team through difficult change. It was the first time she'd ever sought my advice instead of measuring my life against hers. When I arrived for dinner last Sunday, my mother had already placed the crystal tumbler at my seat before anyone else arrived. She didn't announce it. She didn't apologize again. She simply remembered. Sometimes that's what real change looks like. Small. Quiet. Repeated. I was 35 when my sister laughed that I was still alone. The laughter stopped at 8:17 p.m., but the lesson lasted much longer. The crystal tumbler still sits on my table, not as a reminder of humiliation, but of the moment I finally chose dignity over approval. Because the strongest answer isn't the loudest one, it's the moment you quietly put your drink down and decide your worth will never again be measured by someone else's applause.